Welcome to this week's edition of World Crisis Radio. This is Webster Tarpley speaking to you from Washington, D.C. And we now have a civil war raging in eastern Ukraine, and perhaps not only eastern Ukraine, and the, I think, imminent possibility of Russia intervening to restore order and to protect its own citizens and its own co-nationals. According to France 24, cable television news, the day of the attack by Moscow has been set, Friday, May 2nd, 1 week from now. I'm speaking to you at about 1 o'clock in the afternoon on Friday, the 25th of April. So it looks like Friday, May 2nd. Now, of course, this can represent a lot of things. This can represent a Western propaganda lie. It can represent a Russian deception posture. They may attack sooner. They may attack later. But I think we have to now prepare politically, emotionally, logistically for the idea of a wider war. And this is entirely the responsibility of the Kiev fascist clique. And I notice again and again in the Western coverage, this question of fascism, Nazism, is what the West would like to dodge, because this is the most embarrassing aspect of this entire thing for them. And unfortunately, in sharp contrast to the situation under Franklin D. Roosevelt, when the United States was the fascist enemy or anti-fascist power par excellence, leading anybody in the world, today we have fallen so low, and it is so shameful to see the U.S. government actively supporting, imposing fascism. How disgusting. What shame for us here in the United States, right? Our inertia, our fecklessness has allowed this stuff to go on. And in particular, as everybody in the world noticed, when you had CIA boss Brennan go to Kiev a couple of weeks ago, that's the weekend when the fascist boss Turchinov, the so-called president of the Putsch regime, the fascist putschist Turchinov, it was when Brennan was there that this Turchinov issued his first order to the Ukrainian forces, go and kill civilians in eastern Ukraine. That was the order. You are now free. Indeed, you are ordered to go and take measures against civilians, and you're allowed to shoot at them and kill them, lethal force. That was 2 weeks ago this past weekend. This past weekend, then, we had motor-mouthed Joe Biden, and you can see what I've thought about this jerk, this stooge going over there. I wonder, does he think he's getting the support of the Democratic Party base? I certainly hope not. If this is what the Democratic base wants, then God help us. I think a thin layer of rotten, degenerate intellectuals, the responsibility to protect people, the Samantha Power types, they may like it, but I can't imagine the average Democratic voter being in favor of confrontation with Russia. This is too insane. However, when Biden was there this past week, Turchinov went into action again for a second time, ordering the attack, ordering that the Ukrainian forces in the east start killing the people there. So that was what? That was actually 2 weeks ago, and the other one was a week before that. Now, this is all very, very, very dangerous. The obvious connection, right? And I don't think we're in danger of the post hoc ergo propter hoc fallacy. is that when Brennan went, the order was given, and when Biden went, the order was renewed. And you can see the structural weakness of any government of Ukraine is that you've got the West Ukraine that wants one thing and the East Ukraine that wants something else. The East Ukraine has now been whittled down a little bit because of the detachment of the Crimea, now a part of Russia, and off the table, I think, for all practical purposes, and better so. But Brennan and Biden go in there, and they try to force these fateful decisions. Now, Biden has done his work so well that we have just heard the magic words, Third World War, Third World War. Third World War this time around comes out of the mouth of Yats, Victoria Nuland's buddy. Yats, the banker, Yats, the puppet of the International Monetary Fund, Yats, the associate of the kleptocrat Yulia Tymoshenko, Yats, the NATO asset, the EU stooge, and what have you. Yats, in his speech, says that the goal of Russia is to destabilize, to have a regime change. Horrors, who would ever imagine that? And to prevent the election on May 25th. That's now 1 month away. Who knows what happens with that? There are countervailing intrigues going on, to be sure, and to occupy territory of Ukraine. So that's what Yats says. But then he says, we all remember, or many people, or people in general, the World War II is remembered, but now Russia wants World War III. Well, you heard World War III for the first time out of the mouth of Yats. And I urge you once again, I put this out in a Twitter message here, saying, take a look at that mug of Yats. Does his head look like the nose cone of an ICBM or an IRBM? There's an old cartoon of Melvin Laird when he was Nixon's Secretary of Defense, and he had a bald head, somewhat like Yats. And I think it was Herblock who compared the head of Melvin Laird to the nose cone, the warhead of an ICBM or an IRBM missile, intercontinental ballistic missile with nuclear warhead. I think Yats's dome is going to be looking more and more like an ICBM. It's not funny, though. Take a look at that movie The Day After. Take a look. Jason Robards during the Reagan years. And I think right now this is an extremely useful thing to look at, right? And then look back at Yats and his story, right? He wants to be left alone so that he can impose killer austerity. And we have it quite authoritatively from the Washington Post last week, worthy of repetition, since this article from the Washington Post does not seem to have found its way into the chatter of the chattering punditry on the various cable television programs. It is the prospect, and indeed the incipient, the beginning reality of killer, genocidal, brutal austerity, shock therapy on the part of the IMF, the European Commission, and the European Central Bank, all mediated through Turchinov Yatsenyuk in particular, because he's the banker. This is the thing that is driving lots of people to say, let's get out of here. Let's vacate the Ukraine and go somewhere, anywhere. Russia, much better than Ukraine, because in Russia the shock therapy is over. In Ukraine, it's just beginning. So there's a great desire to leave. Back in a minute on World Crisis Radio. Welcome back to World Crisis Radio. I want to remind people now, if you're going to be in New York City, May 30th to June 1st, on one of those 2 days, I'm going to be speaking at the Left Forum in New York City, May 30th to June 1st. So stop by. I'm not sure where this is being held this year. Anyway, you take a look at the website of the Left Forum, and you'll find it there. I'll have more details about that. But save the date of the 30th of May to the first day of June. Now, God willing, we got civil war in Ukraine, and it's because the Yatsenyuk-Turchinov forces, urged on by Brennan, Biden, and we can assume Kerry, Samantha, Miss Rice, Susan Rice, and so forth, they're all hot to trot in this regard, these are acts of absolutely incalculable folly. As of now, we had the Russian Foreign Ministry on Monday, the 21st of April, saying that the Ukrainian regime, the Putsch regime, was responsible for starting a civil war. Russia warned Monday that Ukraine's government is igniting a civil war in the eastern regions of the country, and it said that Moscow is prepared to step in if those efforts do not stop. That, once again, is called intervening to restore order, and it has quite a history in international affairs. It is a principle of international law. If the country next door to you descends into chaos and civil war, you have a right to do something about that, because that's a threat to you. And that is not some novel idea. That is basically a feature of international relations. So they may complain, but that's the way it looks. Now, the Civil War, then, thanks also to the visit by Biden, has stoked up. The most recent now is that on Thursday morning, actually, let's go back to Easter Sunday, right? Easter Sunday morning, we had 2 or 3 or 4 pro-Russian self-defense forces killed at a checkpoint by right sector fascist killers, by Ukrainian forces, who knows? And Thursday, we had about 5, say half a dozen, pro-Russian self-defense people killed at another checkpoint by the different forces, be it Ukrainian special forces this time, or right sector killers. Now, this, of course, the pattern, you remember, with the Nazis, it would be an SS division, typically with an Einsatzgruppe, right? So the SS would go in with an Einsatzgruppe, and then there'd be the Hilfswillige, right? The Hiwis, the local people who would actually do most of the killing, so that the SS was sometimes at arm's length. I mean, they set it up, and then they would send in the natives, so to speak, a native unit to go in and do the killing, the so-called Hiwis. Hiwi was be a Hilfswillige. So that's the pattern, right? They're using the Nazi pattern, as in so many other things the Kiev regime has done. So we've also got then, 5 yesterday, that was Thursday, the 24th of April. This morning, we've got a helicopter of the Kiev fascist clique destroyed by a rocket-propelled grenade. You know, that's the one ingredient that we haven't seen that much of. We've seen skinheads, we've seen chains, clubs, we've seen Molotov bottles, and so forth, but we hadn't seen the RPGs, Kalashnikovs, plenty of those, other kinds of automatic weapons, but not the RPG. Well, the RPG has now made its debut, and that is in this area of Slavyansk, and this has been an attack on a Ukrainian regime helicopter, which has been destroyed, according to film, and I think even acknowledged by the Kiev fascist clique. So what is the attempt? Apparently, there's a lot of uncertainty in the Ukrainian forces. The draftees, the normal troops, are completely unreliable. You can see them on television saying, I don't want to shoot, this is not what I want. There may be special forces, in other words, degraded special privilege types who are willing to kill other Ukrainians. They may be there, and that seems to be what the regime has scraped together and has decided to send in. However, all of this is overshadowed. We're told by the Russian defense minister Shoigu estimates that it's about 11,000 Ukrainian forces that are now in the east. He's got 250 tanks. He's got other estimates that go along with it. But they're overshadowed by 40,000 better trained, better equipped Russian forces who have now come up right up to the border, right, 1 or 2 kilometers away from the border. And we've even got reports of overflights. All of these are likely harbingers of some kind of an impending battle. Right? It's the first time since 1941 that something like this has happened in this part of the world, or at least since 1944, 45. The Russian military, according to the Washington Post of this morning, Friday, April 25th, the Russian military has begun tactical drills in response to events across the border, near the border in Ukraine, says Russian Defense Minister Sergei Shoigu. If Ukraine's war machine does not halt, this will lead to a large number of casualties. Quote, we have to react to such a development. And on the other side, we have Petro Poroshenko, written Poroshenko. This is the chocolate king, right? This is the agent of the international chocolate cartel, right? He's the Cadbury Fry man on the scene. Poroshenko, the chocolate king, an oligarch, this is the guy who was paying $25 a day to large groups of Maidanchiki, right, of Maidan hooligans to stay there and fight. Poroshenko is leading in the election. How about that? You want to have an election on May 25th, and the chocolate king, a leading oligarch, gets to take over, and you pass under the control of the British-centered Cadbury Fry cocoa cartel. He accuses the Russians of having sent 3 military helicopters into Ukrainian airspace, and it will be probed. And we'll be back in a minute on World Crisis Radio. Welcome back to World Crisis Radio. Remember, Left Forum, New York City, 30th of May, 1st of June. I'll be there. The rest of it, I can't put my hand in the fire for the other speakers, but we will have an interesting panel that I'll be there with and some others. But now back to this Ukrainian situation. Our man Poroshenko, the chocolate king, says that he wants the Russians to withdraw their troops from the border. They're all screaming about this because they realize, I think, that the axe may be about to fall on them. The U.S. says, we are watching Russian troop movements on the border with great concern. Any further Russian military intervention into Ukraine would be a grave mistake. Now, inside the eastern Ukraine, what is the strategy of these of the Ukrainian side, or the Kiev fascist cabal there? Some of the checkpoints outside of Donetsk were taken over by Kiev loyal forces, and this is where the 5 self-defense forces were killed. Here we have Yuri Lutsenko, spokesman for the Kiev fascist clique, says, today was the first step of the anti-terror operation. Today we established control, or finally we established control, on the main highway between Kharkov and Rostov-on-Don. Rostov-on-Don, of course, is the mouth of the Don there, coming down into the Sea of Azov, and that's Russia, right? That's where Yanukovych is thought to be. And then we pushed the terrorists into Slavyansk. You know, he says terrorists, he means the Russian self-defense people. So that's the strategy. The Kharkov to Rostov road, and they're trying to surround Slavyansk. And that seems to be what a lot of this stuff is. Remember also, you've got Taruta, a rich oligarch specialized in asset stripping of older industrial areas, right? He's the guy who destroyed Gdansk and the Lenin shipyard in Poland. This Taruta is now there in Donetsk, and he wants to start asset stripping that immense complex of coal and steel production, which could be a great thing for the world, right? If you want to build the worldwide fast rail, maglev rail, you better have some steel rails, and this place could make them, especially if you upgraded it. So he's out there, and he says, "Oh no, this is just criminal elements who have taken over these buildings." I take it that the big moment will come if and when the Ukrainian, the Kiev fascist forces manage to attack one of the public buildings, which have now been fortified, and then we get into a firefight, and we have to see what happens there. You also have to remember, right, you look at the American Revolution. What was the breakdown in the American Revolution? 1/3 were patriots and wanted independence, 1/3 were inert and didn't care, and 1/3 were Tories and wanted to stay with the British. And it's never the case that it's an overwhelming majority, right? You look at the experience of the French Revolution after the first phase, right? The first elected assembly, majority royalist, and in the Russian case, the Duma that came together for January of 1918, that also had a majority socialist revolutionary peasant party, pro-Kerensky kind of majority. So you have to bear in mind these things, right? Successful revolution is not a matter of majority vote. It has to do with activism and with organization. So this is it. Now, the U.S., cry the beloved country here. The U.S. has sent in 160 troops, paratroopers, I guess, from the base in Vicenza, Italy. And that's the beginning of 600, and they're going to be a kind of a road show. They're going to be on the road. This is like the Marx Brothers movie, The Road to Estonia, I guess. They're going to be in Poland, Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia, right? So they're going all the way east, and they're essentially there to cavort around and prance and brandish weapons and show that the U.S. is standing with these people. I think we have to face the fact that this is another crime of Clinton, specifically, a crime of Clinton to allow Poland, Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia into NATO, where these hot-headed governments, with their history of intemperate and uncontrolled outbursts against the Russians based on hatred, and forgetting that it was, of course, Russia that liberated them from Nazism, nobody else, they are constantly looking for friction with Russia, right? And this is the terrible dynamic of this kind of a standoff, is that these little places acquire an inordinate power over world events, right? It was said in World War I, it was the Magyar-Hungarian landowners who had this big influence over the Vienna government of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and that had the big influence over Germany, and this meant that this entire part of the equation was in bad shape. Not the cause, the British are the main cause, but this was certainly something that made things look worse. Count Berchtold of Vienna, very bad role, right? Well, certainly one of the people co-responsible for the outbreak of war. So that's the kind of situation. I would just point out, if you had a U.S.-Russian condominium, if you had the U.S. and Russia decide that the problems of Europe, the Middle East, maybe North Africa, parts of Central Asia could be jointly administered, you wouldn't have these problems, because in that case, these little places would not be important, and you could simply impose reasonable rules on these turbulent little states and tell them to take their grievances and their cahiers de doléances and so forth and shove it, because this is simply not tolerable. And that would include if we have the breakdown of the Israeli-Palestinian peace process. I am coming to believe that the only way you'll ever have an Israeli-Palestinian peace process concluded is if it's imposed on both sides by Russia and the United States, saying, look, we don't want war. We don't want some stupid thing in the Balkans or the Middle East, in this case, to start World War III, which Comrade Yatsenyuk is now talking about. So we just don't want that. So you are going to learn to get along. You're going to solve your problems, and if you can't compromise, we'll impose a compromise on you. That would be the tremendous advantage of a U.S.-Russian condominium. It would satisfy the desire of Russia to be recognized, and it's a justified desire, to be recognized as a great power, and therefore a joint administration. The main barrier in this is the insane crackpot U.S. ruling class, and we're seeing them on parade, right? We're seeing these people. The speech by Kerry last night, that would be the 24th of April, I believe, his Tale of Two Countries speech, where Russia is always bad and the Ukrainian fascist clique is always good, and he's ready to act. It simply shows that guy is ready for a straitjacket, and the choice, would you like to be in Bellevue in the city, or would you like to go out a little bit on the island to Creedmoor and be treated there? Back in a minute on World Crisis Radio. Welcome back to World Crisis Radio. Keep up with everything at Tarpley.net. I'm going to recommend two books. Let me just get ahead of myself here. I really want you to get, if you haven't read Obama, the Postmodern Coup, The Making of a Manchurian Candidate, you ought to get that, because it basically, in January and February and March of 2008, during the primaries, I was pointing out that the Obama regime is going to go to a confrontation with Russia. And here I have, Trilateral Commission co-founder Brzezinski wants a global showdown with Russia and China, far more dangerous for the United States than the Bush-Cheney Iraq adventure. Yeah, and now you've got it. So, once again, prophetic, if I do say so myself. I know what's going on in the world, and there's one piece of proof. And then, for the Cliven Bundy issue, I want you to get, if you haven't got it, Just Too Weird, Bishop Romney and the Mormon Takeover of America, Polygamy, Theocracy, and Subversion. And we know we've got Cliven on subversion. Whether we've got him on theocracy, I don't know. And the interesting one is, can we get Cliven on polygamy, which I think is the issue on the table, so to speak. Now, the situation, therefore, I have to ask once again, are we in July 1914? Are we in that kind of dream time that is reported by so many writers, right, by Arnold Zweig, or Stefan Zweig, sorry, and Roger Martin Dugard, Nobel Prize winner in the 30s, that dreamlike unreality of July 1914. If I get a chance to dip into these books again, I will try to report on them, but you get the idea. You look at these self-satisfied, priggish, other-directed so-called intellectuals, pundits, whatever they are, spouting this absolute nonsense. And they have to do it because they're tied to Kerry and the idiocy that he puts out, and Biden and Obama, of course, since those are the speeches that he that he reads, are we in July 1914? Now, one promising aspect of this situation, and I mentioned this briefly last week, let's try to go into a little bit more, and we're going to be talking about this week to week. The question of globalization. Remember that globalization is simply a kind of euphemism, or it's the term for the American empire of the post-1991 era. In other words, it's not the U.S. empire of 1955 or 1965 or 70, whatever it is. It's specifically post-1991. It's the time of unipolarity. It is the time when Russia, to a significant degree because of their own mistakes, don't forget that, but also because, of course, tremendous economic warfare, encirclement, COCOM list, technology boycott, and everything else, coming from the West, from the U.S., and maintained to the present day, that the Soviet Union collapsed, right? The Warsaw Pact broke up, the Soviet Union broke up, and what you're left with now is the Russian Federation. And this was brought to you by the incompetence and the corruption and the venality of people like Gorbachev, Yeltsin, Chubais, Yegor Gaidar, and on and on. So we have unipolarity. And the name of the unipolarity, instead of calling it the unipolar empire, it's called globalization. Now, one of our principal tasks, as listeners know, is to put an end to this period of globalization. It has been not just politically suffocating, but economically bad for the world, very bad. And could it be brought to an end? Well, I begin to see possibilities. The news this week is that the Russian credit rating on Russian government bonds has been cut to one notch, as they say, above junk status. And this is Standard & Poor's has cut Russia to virtual junk status. Now, there is, we have to remember, right, 1998, the GKO crisis, the Russian government bonds, there was a default of the Russian state in 1998, which put an end to the promises from Chubais, Gaidar, Kudrin, the Nemtsov, all these people, the Union, now the Union of Right Forces, they were promising, the young reformers were promising singing tomorrows. Well, that ended in 1998 when all the Russians lost their savings accounts, which had already been destroyed in the hyperinflation of 1992. So with Russia, you're dealing with a country that's been wiped out twice in recent memory. 1992, hyperinflation of 1,200% wiped out savings accounts. 1998 did it again because the banks went bankrupt. So that is now the threat that is being brandished. The third time around, I would say don't do it. You get people very angry with that. And I won't go into the obvious parallels, but, 1923 certainly didn't improve the mood in Berlin, and another round of this stuff will not with Russia. But here's the idea. If the Wall Street finance oligarchs and associated predators insist on pushing their kept politicians down this road, sanctions, sector sanctions, and the attack, now you can see, an attack on the Russian currency and an attack on the Russian bonds, what will that do? It may be the beginning of the end of globalization. Because it's obvious what you do if you come under that kind of attack. You put up currency controls, you put up exchange controls, you put up capital controls, and with that, the endless blather of globalization goes out the window. And you have to think about forms of not even autarky, but creating a bloc. There, it's not clear whether it will hold up in whole or even in part, right? The BRICS, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa. It's there, at least nominally. How many of them are prepared to go with the West? If this character Modi wins in India, I am not optimistic about India under Modi, but some of the others, you can't tell. China in particular, right? They will have to make a decision, which normally they don't like to do, right? Those apparatchiki there in Beijing, but they're going to have to. And the question is, what are you going to do then? Russia has been forced to make these decisions. You remember that the entire strategy of the Russian oligarchy over the past 20 years has been to project an anti-Western ideology on the inside of the country and at the same time to attempt to integrate Russia into the International Monetary Fund, the World Trade Organization, the OECD, and every other possible organization. Now, that may now come to a halt. Russia has been downgraded. Sector sanctions may be imminent. The beauty of Russia is that because of its size, because of its geopolitical position, because of its natural resources, because of its general importance, it has the ability alone, perhaps not to completely destroy the edifice of globalization, but to undermine it and to put such cracks in it that its survival will be brought into serious question. And we might say at this point that the mad dog ruling class of the Western world will have nobody but themselves to thank. You stage a coup d'etat in Kiev, and then when the Russian countermeasures begin, you start whining. It's ridiculous. And then your entire globalization system, under which you've all become rich, comes down. So that's your fault. Don't blame it on Moscow. Blame it on yourself. Back in a minute on World Crisis Radio. Welcome back to World Crisis Radio. Webster Tarpley here in Washington, D.C. I think I mentioned last week that we had U.S. anti-tank missiles going to Syria. I think it's probably too little and too late. The best thing for Syria would be to have the hostilities cease without any further foreign intervention. But of course, we know apparently the division of labor is that the Qatar people pay for the terrorist death squads that come in through the rat line of Turkey, and Saudi Arabia is now focusing on terrorists coming in through the rat line of Jordan and the Jordanian camps, and training going on in the Jordanian camps to teach these the jihadis, these death squads, to use the anti-tank and perhaps anti-aircraft missiles that the U.S. is giving them. And I say again to Obama, the first airplane that goes down with one of those missiles is going to be the end of you, because your Republican friends will be delighted to impeach you for that, and the neocons will join in. But now, having gone through this entire situation with Ukraine. Oh, one other issue, right? One of the crosstalk episodes on Russia Today this week had to do with the vote to impeach, to oust Yanukovych from the presidency, and was this a legal vote? And there was one loudmouth American jerk on there who was claiming that this was legal. No, not legal. Legal is when Hitler drove the communists out of the Reichstag before voting the enabling laws, right? Because the communists would have voted against them. If you kick out, 100 members of the Reichstag, you can then get your majority. So Hitler's seizure of power was not legal, because he had purged the parliament in advance. And something similar went on in Kiev with the Rada. That is to say, the Ukrainian Rada was meeting under siege in the sense that they were killers from the right sector and indeed from the Svoboda party outside who they stood ready to liquidate members of parliament who did not vote for the impeachment of Yanukovych. So they were acting under duress. It's, again, very much like the attempt of the French fascists to take over the National Assembly in February 1934, right? The Stavisky affair, as it's often known. But in this case, the Rada had a gun to its head under duress. That vote is not valid. And even, or perhaps partially due to this fact, in order to impeach, my understanding of the Ukrainian constitution is you've got to get 2/3, maybe 3/4, but I think 2/3 of the parliament, that is to say, of the whole parliament, not of those voting, but of the entire number of deputies that exist. You got to get 2/3 of that. And precisely because of the heavy-handed stuff, quite a few people didn't show up. They were not going to vote to oust Yanukovych, so they stayed home or ran away. And then the measure fell short. It had a nice big majority, but it did not get the 2/3 that it needed. I think it got something like 338, and it needed something over 500, whatever it was. So it is illegal. The whole thing is illegal. Now, let's go into an area of historical parallels. One little premise, right? We're working on the origins of Ukraine, right, as a synthetic country, a Potemkin country, having been concocted, and we've seen it, right? The constitution of the Ukrainian state was without a question the will of the German General Staff of Hindenburg, von Hindenburg and Ludendorff in late 1917, early 1918. The idea of it is resurrected by these intellectuals, the poet Taras Shevchenko, and some certain number of historians. But notice that the idea, it goes back a little bit further, right? In the buildup, the British intelligence was totally mobilized in the 1840s against what they called the arbitrary powers, right? Against Prussia, Austria, and Russia, the Holy Alliance, the three. As there had been a quintuple alliance, but the British and the French dropped out after a while, and Metternich pushed ahead with with Russia, Prussia, and Austria. This became the three emperors diplomacy a little bit later on. So this was the target for the British, and one of the things that they seem to have promoted is something called the Brotherhood of St. Cyril and Methodius. And the question is that a direct Mazzini organization, right? You can look on Tarpley.net, and you'll see the conference of the Schiller Institute in 1994, 1995. Back then, this was the Lord Palmerston's Human Zoo, where there was some attention to the Mazzini networks, right? And Mazzini, of course, documented British agent, paid agent of the British Admiralty, case officer Admiral Stansfeld of the British Admiralty. Mazzini had created these groups: Young Italy, Young Germany, Young France, Young England, Young America. There's even a little town in Minnesota named after this. That was Franklin Pierce, proto-Confederate, was the product of that Young America. And on and on. Was there a Young Ukraine? On paper, no, but at least one scholar has advanced the idea that the Young Ukraine was actually this Brotherhood of St. Cyril and Methodius, which actually went beyond Ukraine, but still had this idea. Now, if you look at the program of St. Cyril and Methodius, it's not that bad, but you have to realize that there's a great deal of cynicism from the British, right, who would promise 4 different ethnic groups a certain city, right? They'd say, let's take city X. They'd promise it to everybody in the neighborhood and try to get them to all act to overthrow the existing government with the idea that they would then be at each other's throats. Now, I wanted to somehow illuminate the convergence of these issues, the Ukrainian issues and the Eastern European issues on the one hand, with the U.S. domestic issues as they have emerged in the past week. And I want to talk about Cliven Bundy. Cliven Bundy, as I put out a week ago, 2 weeks ago, is obviously a Mormon fundamentalist. He's a Mormon, and I have every reason to think that his taste in theology inclines to the fundamentals. So he may or may not be an active member of the Fundamentalist Latter-day Saints, FLDS. But according to all published accounts, he's LDS, and again, he may also be FLDS, or he may be that rather, right? Because when the outsider looks at this and they say Mormon, they don't quite realize what the differences are. So he, of course, he's all those things: a freeloader, a moocher, a tax cheat, a tax evader, somebody who scoffs at the rule of law. He says he doesn't recognize the United States government. Gosh, does he pay his income taxes? If he has been refusing to pay his income tax for the past 20 years, then how come he hasn't been charged? Because for the rest of us, we would be hauled into court. Why not Cliven? What is so special about Cliven? And we'll be back in a minute to continue this line of thought. Welcome back to World Crisis Radio. Up in Washington, D.C. Now, the case of Cliven Bundy. Again, he has acted out the Mormon ideology, as far as I can see. That is to say, he rejects the authority of the United States government. Get a hold of my book, Just Too Weird, Bishop Romney and the Mormon Takeover of America, and you will see that in the late 1850s, we have Brigham Young and the Utah Territory seceding from the United States, presumably because British intelligence, with which they were for sure in contact because of the large number of Mormon missionaries that were in Britain and were reporting back. This was designed to converge with the actions of the famous Confederate Freemasons who pushed through the secession. In many cases, we're using dubious methods. And if we take a look at the book, Just Too Weird, Bishop Romney and the Mormon Takeover, we find here Brigham Young's Insurrection Proclamation of September 15th, 1857. Wagon trains have to stay out of Utah, and it's time to kill Americans coming through, and that's going to be the Mountain Meadows Massacre. We now know that not only Senator Lee of Utah is a descendant of the infamous perpetrator of the guy who gave the orders to kill at the Mountain Meadows Massacre and was shot for it, but we've also got Cliven Bundy is a descendant of the Mountain Meadows Massacre. So his rejection of the authority of the United States government is simply the classic Mormon position. Brigham Young, of course, indicted for treason 3 times, but with a similar method, right? There were so many armed Mormon crazies out there that there was a reluctance to try to round him up, and that was going on, right? He was eventually tamed by the coming of the Union General Connor, an Irish Catholic, as the irony of fate would have it, who essentially kept him on a short leash during the Civil War. And then once the railroad was there, the United States was able to ship in enough troops at any time so that this entire Mormon militarized day-night operation had to cool it. So that's Cliven, right? But now also remember that the theology of Joseph Smith is racist. And when Mitt Romney's father, George Romney, was running for president, back in the 1960s, 68, I guess was the year. George Romney went to Vietnam and was asked by black GIs, why should I fight for the world that you represent where I wouldn't have any rights? I'd be simply consigned to the outer darkness, right? And remember, even though the regulations have changed, the sacred books still consign anybody black to the outer darkness. You're not going to get into this heaven on Kolob or whatever they're looking forward to. So that's Cliven. But now let's think of a couple of things. Suppose we look at Cliven's anti-government ideology. He says, I'm a rancher. I'm a landowner. He's a big landowner. He's a latifundist. He's what in Germany would be called a Junker. It's written Junker, Juncker, but because of the German Junker, the East Elbian Junkers, that is to say the people in Germany who were big landowners east of the Elbe River, which sort of goes from Hamburg south to Prague, right? Anybody east of that line was a landowner, was part of this reactionary class. This is Prussia, of course, and these East Elbian Junkers provided the officer corps for the Prussian army, but they're generally very reactionary. That is why it was so crazy to see various breathless websites saying, oh, this is the new American Revolution. Revolutions, dear friends, are seldom directed by big landowners. That's not a very good cause. And we should also think of this. There are oligarchs and oligarchs, right? The kind of oligarch that we have to deal with here in the megalopolis corridor, right? Boston and New York, Philadelphia, Baltimore, Washington, and so on down. We have to deal with finance oligarchs. These are bankers. They're urban. They operate in cities, although they've concocted an ideology for the rubes, the bumpkins, the hayseeds, and the cits who are out there. But the older kind of oligarch is a landowning oligarch. It's a latifundist. It's somebody with a big feudal estate. That's oligarchy in the older, more feudal method. So it's not surprising to see Cliven coming out with a typical sort of neo-feudal approach. He says, I deny the power of the central state. I accept the power of the local entity. Of course, the local entity is much weaker, and as we've seen, it's much easier for a great oligarch to bend the local state to his will, right? He had Senator Heller endorsing him. Now, I can't not mention the high comedy of the reactionary Republicans who endorsed Cliven, who are now running for the hills because of Cliven's racist tirade of this week, and in particular, that man of principle, Rand Paul, who has been backtracking. Little Rand has been backtracking on his anti-war position as the Republicans have gone ballistic on Ukraine, and they want to stop Putin. And then again now on this, because Little Rand, along with Heller and Reince Priebus of the Republican National Committee, they've all been trying to embrace Cliven until the New York Times report on Thursday, I guess it was, that is yesterday, that would be the 24th of April, or was it the day before, where Cliven has his racist tirade, which is absolutely typical. We've seen this with Ron Paul's newsletters. We've seen it with Rand and that guy, the Confederate Avenger that he had in his office. Little Rand has had to kick two people out of his office for neo-Confederate or white supremacist or racist or other sorts of remarks. So this is part of the outlook of these people. But notice the fun of seeing the Republicans run for cover. Look at them scatter. Look at them scamper We'll be back in a minute on World Crisis Radio. Welcome back to World Crisis Radio. The racist tirade by Cliven Bundy and the response. Now we've got Senator Dean Heller, Republican of Nevada, running for the Hills. Little Rand Paul, Republican of Kentucky, running for the Hills. I think that Little Rand's political career is now in grave danger, because we must remember that Little Rand embraces the philosophy of Cliven, which is the philosophy of Ron Paul philosophy, their obsessive belief structure, that property rights trump everything, right? That the 1964 Civil Rights Act is a monstrosity because it sets human rights, the right to use a common carrier, which is sanctified under the Anglo-Saxon common law. Once you set up as a common carrier, you got to take anybody who can pay for the ticket. But no, says Little Rand, there's got to be that extra element. Forget about common carrier, the absolute license and caprice, the freedom, the liberty of the proprietor to kick people out based on race. That has to be preserved. One of the things we're going to find here is that when we hear people like Little Rand or Cliven Bundy talking about liberty and freedom, it means something different from what you think, and there's a big historical basis of this. Liberty in the 1500s, 1600s, and in some places well into the 1700s, liberty and freedom does not mean what you think. It means special privilege enjoyed by one group at the expense of another. As I go through this historical recounting, which I'd now like to initiate today and try to continue it next week and perhaps beyond that. When you hear people talking about, say, Venice and the defense of Republican liberty, that doesn't mean what you think. It means the unlimited ability of the Venetian oligarchy to oppress its own people and defy the world, right? To the hatred of foreigners in that case. But when we come to the question of the Holy Roman Empire and what destroyed it, the people, the nobility and the princes of the Holy Roman Empire, country that does not exist, has not existed for 200 years, their program was German liberties. German liberties. What that meant was the right of the nobility to run wild with misrule and to impose that on everybody else. And then perhaps the most extreme example, the Polish Commonwealth or the Polish Republic, which disappeared around 1795 and was not heard of again until the Treaty of Versailles. The Polish Commonwealth, their idea, they even called it the Golden Liberty, the Golden Liberty. And it was the Polish liberty. But who received it? Only the nobility, only the Schlachta and the Magnati, the lower nobility and the top super nobility. So when you hear somebody like Cliven say liberty, what he means is license, his ability to impose his backward views on you or to defy the federal government so that he can mooch and freeload and so forth. But again, the interesting part is to deny the authority of the state. We are in a world framework in which it's either the nation state or chaos. Deal with this. Either the nation state or chaos. Sorry, libertarians, you bet wrong. You bought into a doctrine that was imported by David Rockefeller and funded by the Koch brothers, and you are useful idiots. You are being strung along, and you'll rue the day if you live long enough and you can put the cause and effect together, which in many cases, of course, they can't do. So that's what's happening with those Republicans. But now, having made this point that freedom and liberty, up to the 18th century certainly, was applied to specific groups. You even hear it in something like when a very distinguished king came to Munich, Bavaria, they gave him the freedom of the city. The freedom of the city means that the oligarchy that runs the city, probably bankers in the city, allowed this guy to have special privileges, which normally only they have. Now let's take a look at this. what would a world be like if the ideas of Cliven Bundy, and it means Rand Paul and Ron Paul and these other kooks and crackpots, what would that look like? Well, we have some idea. And in particular, with the Cliven Bundy side of it, with the latifundist, the rancher, the big landowner, the rich cultivator, we can see. Here's a good starting point. Take a look at a map of Europe as it was, say, in 1770. And what you're going to see is that Eastern Europe is essentially three big conglomerates. In the area where you'd expect to see Germany, it says Holy Roman Empire. And that is a crazy quilt of 2,000 different countries, microstates, mini-states, and so forth. Then you've got up to the southeast of that, the Ottoman Empire, the Turks. Some maps will also show you a very thin corridor, which was what was left of Hungary at that point. But the Ottoman Empire, the entire Balkans, the entire Crimea, the entire northern shore of the Black Sea, Greece, Anatolia, Turkey, all Ottoman Empire. And then, stretching from the Baltic Sea practically to the Black Sea, the Republic of Poland. So that's what you find. 1770, Holy Roman Empire, big. Republic of Poland, Commonwealth of Poland, big. Ottoman Empire, big. You look at that same map 50 years later, right, 1820, the Holy Roman Empire is gone, no longer exists. Finish, kaput. And Poland, which had been the biggest country in Europe, except for Russia, gone, disappeared, rolled over, and with not terribly much fighting involved. Then, of course, the Ottoman Empire driven back somewhat by the new states. And, of course, it's Prussia and Austria and Russia that carve up Poland and take significant chunks of the Ottoman Empire, and the Holy Roman Empire collapses. What is it that destroys these countries? It is the lack of a strong and functioning central government. It is neo-feudalism. And it's neo-feudalism for this reason. When you look back, say, around 1600, in Western Europe, the idea of serfdom is on the defensive, and it's being wiped out. And of course, this happens in the French Revolution. But already by 1700, there's no serfdom in England. There's no serfdom in much of Italy, and similarly on from there. But in Eastern Europe, there's a new serfdom. There's a new wave of serfdom. In other words, people who are practically slaves but are attached to the land, theoretically, can't be moved around, have to stay on the land, but are bought and sold within that framework. This has a new rebirth, a new renaissance of serfdom in the 1600s into the 1700s on a capitalist basis, on the basis of these managers and lords and magnates, landowners getting big money for cash crops. Because remember, what does Cliven do with those cattle? He's going to sell them, and it's expensive, right? Those are big. If you have a herd of 1,000 cattle, that's a big investment, and it's going to be a big profit. Of course, Cliven thinks that he has the right to that, right? I should be able to rip off the federal government because I've always done it, and he might argue that his sacred books argue that this should be so. We'll be back in a minute on World Crisis Radio. Welcome back to World Crisis Radio. We've only got 10 minutes left. Let's try to wrap up this first phase of our analysis, right? Cliven Bundy tells us something about the U.S. today, the ideological poisons that are widely circulated, right? The unbelievable misconceptions that we find as a result of this financed propaganda. Again, David Rockefeller, the Koch brothers, they pay for libertarian propaganda, so forth, right? There's a book called Invisible Hands that goes through a certain phase of this stuff, maybe not naming the biggest of the names, but you get the idea. The Volcker Foundation, not the same as the central bank guy as far as I know, but there it goes. However, that is the libertarianism is poison for a body politic. Needless to say, right-wing anarchism. Now let's take a look. I'm arguing. I want you to, if you can, if it's convenient, the famous history text from half a century ago, A History of the Modern World by R.R. Palmer of Princeton. This is Alfred A. Knopf, New York, 1961. Make sure you get this edition and not subsequent ones, because they're all dumbed down as time goes on. Chapter 22, Three Aging Empires, and that's what I just went through with you. The three aging empires are Holy Roman Empire, Republic of Poland, and Ottoman Empire, and they are essentially swept aside by Prussia, Russia, and Austria. And the benefit of this analysis is it not only allows us to look at Cliven in historical context, but we can also look at Ukraine, because a lot of this area, the fascist area of Ukraine, is the part that was under Poland, Lvov, and such places, right? Podolia, these areas. So we're actually talking about both. But right now, let's just talk about the Holy Roman Empire. Notice the philosophy of the sovereign individual. We had the Browns, Ed and Eileen Brown, with their notion that they were sovereign individuals. They didn't have to pay the federal income tax. I guess Cliven has a bigger, fortress, glacis area so that he can defend himself better. But the Browns, of course, they had a similar gaggle of armed militiamen around them, right? Government by armed gang in the service of rich people. I'm sorry. The 1920s and 1930s teach us that government by armed gang in the service of rich people is not conducive to a general welfare and to the general freedom and liberty of the entire population. I'm stressing this because I don't want you to think that liberty has the 17th century sense of special privilege. No. But let's look. What are the factors that determined the destruction, in particular, of the Holy Roman Empire and the Republic of Poland? Because those were the two that disappeared. Ottoman Empire was still there, although cut down. They had problems of their own. But let's look at this, because we're looking in particular at latifundists, what it's like if people of the Cliven Bundy type, large landowners, latifundists, if they get their way, and if they're allowed to weaken the central state with the help of bands of armed retainers. Now, let's look at the Holy Roman Empire. Let's look at it especially after the 30 Years' War, after the Peace of Westphalia. So we're now in the second half of the 17th century, right, 1650 to 1700. In Germany, we do have, of course, Leibniz, and Leibniz alone is enough to make this a golden age for the world, and we've got Bach. So between Leibniz and Bach, intellectually it's a golden age, but politically not too doggone good. And let's see what R.R. Palmer says about this, right? The obvious thing is what the Germans called Kleinstaaterei, little countries, little fragments. Hey, I hope you Scots take note. Don't take the plunge. You're going to regret it. You'll see. Here we go from R.R. Palmer. Quote, the low state of Germany in the second half of the 1600s was due mainly to old political evils. After the 30 Years' War, each state had sovereign rights. These states, and he's got states in quotes, numbered 300 or 2,000, depending on how they were counted. The higher figure, the 2,000, included the knights of the empire, Knights, right, with a K, the Reichsritter. So the higher figure of 2,000 includes the knights of the empire, found especially in South Germany and the Rhineland, so west and south. These were persons who acknowledged no overlordship except that of the emperor himself, right? But since the emperor, whom the knights regarded as their only superior, had in fact no authority, the knights were in effect private persons enjoying sovereign status. one-man countries, in effect. The last, and this is the epitaph, they were the last anomaly of bizarre neo-feudalism and distorted freedom, I would say, of bizarre neo-feudalism and perverted freedom, or freedom in reverse, because for most people it was oppression. But of course, poor R.R. Palmer, he was much too optimistic. He didn't reckon with Cliven and with the sovereign individuals, in other words, right-wing anarchists who think that they can deny the power of the modern state, or indeed the positive aspects. How can you say you love the Constitution and you hate the government that's based on it? If you look in Just Too Weird about Romney and the Mormons, you'll see that that's the classic Brigham Young position. We love the Constitution, but we hate this government. Something there doesn't quite rhyme. All right, so these knights of the empire. The knights, what is it like to be a sovereign individual? The knights had tiny estates of their own, averaging not over 100 acres apiece, consisting of a castle and a manor or two, enclosed by the territory of a larger state, but not forming a part of it. These free knights, or knights of the empire, had arisen in various ways. In Württemberg, in the southwest, the lords simply ceased to attend the diet, the assembly, and they won exemption from the duke's jurisdiction. They retired to their own domains, leaving the surface of Baden-Württemberg pockmarked with small units politically independent of it. It was as if in England, the peers, the members of the House of Lords, had lost interest in the House of Lords and had set up independently, each on his own estates, as a separate country. Since the emperor, again, he was far away, he had no power, these people were effectively one-man countries, completely heteronomic, completely sociopathic. So there were then 300 mini-states. This is the crazy quilt, this checkerboard of the Holy Roman Empire. Now, all of these states, the 300 and then the 1700, right? The 300 things that look sort of like mini-states, and then the 1700 one-man countries. All these states were intent on preserving what were called the German liberties, Germanic liberties. Liberty means special privilege. The Germanic liberties meant freedom of the member states from control by the emperor or the empire. The assembly, the imperial diet, the imperial congress of these oligarchs, possessed the power to raise troops and raise taxes, impose taxes for the whole empire, but this power was never used. So it means that one of the Germanic liberties is that landowners, like these imperial knights, pay no taxes. Sound familiar? Cloven? So what happens to this? Well, it becomes a playground for foreign powers, particularly the French, and it's essentially gone. It's overwhelmed by Napoleon, and Germany would have been gone too, except from within this, there was Austria, there was Prussia, and these then maintained themselves as countries. For an even more chilling example, tune in next week. We're going to do the story of the Republic of Poland, and you'll get some insights into Zbigniew Brzezinski's thinking processes. See you next week on World Crisis Radio.